In the spring of 1943, deep within the heart of Germany, a battered wooden crate arrived at the Kummersdorf Proving Ground. Its label read simply, US 57mm Gun M1. Inside lay an American anti-tank weapon that German troops had captured in North Africa, one of the thousands hastily abandoned as the Axis collapsed in Tunisia. To the engineers waiting to inspect it, the gun looked almost comical, a thin barrel, lightweight carriage, a toy compared to their heavy Pak 40s or the monstrous 88. They laughed quietly as the weapon was rolled off the truck, the sound echoing across the cobblestones of the test yard. In their minds, it was just another example of American naivety. Mass-produced simplicity pretending to be sophistication. The weapon, though, carried a quiet confidence in its steel. It was no experimental design but a refined evolution of the British six-pounder, adapted and improved by American industry. Where German guns demanded constant care, fine machining, and skilled hands, this weapon looked as though it had been built by men who expected mud, dust, and haste. The breech block locked with an audible, decisive snap. The traverse gears turned smoothly, unbothered by grit. It was a soldier's tool, not an engineer's ornament. Yet at Kummersdorf, beauty still meant complexity, and the engineers' pride made them blind to what they held. They wheeled the 57mm gun onto the firing lane reserved for captured Allied weapons. Beyond the safety wall stood the carcass of a Panzer III, its engine stripped, its armor pitted from previous tests. The target plate at 100 meters was measured at 50 millimeters thick. Face-hardened steel once thought invulnerable to anything under 75 millimeters. The technicians loaded a single round, an armor-piercing shot marked M70, the American equivalent of the British APCBC. The projectile was small, neat, and black-tipped. One engineer, grinning, muttered that it looked better suited for a museum diorama than a battlefield. When the breach closed, the laughter faded to routine silence. Instruments were checked, the chronograph armed, and the range officer gave the signal. The first shot cracked through the morning air, the sound sharper than expected, more violent than its size promised. A puff of smoke cleared, and the observers turned toward the target. A clean hole, round, bright, and unmistakable, glared back at them through the steel plate. No spalling, no cracking, just a perfect perforation. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then another round was fired, and another hole appeared, slightly higher. They increased the distance, adjusted the angle, thickened the armor. Still, the projectile punched through. The laughter that had greeted the weapon's arrival did not return. Someone quietly wrote in the log, Durchschlag bei 80 mm Panzerstahl, 30 Grad Neigung, penetration of 80 millimeters of armor at 30 degrees. Numbers that placed this toy gun on par with their own celebrated Pak 40. The realization unsettled them. The Americans had achieved, with half the weight and cost, what German industry had strained to reach. Simplicity, it seemed, was its own form of genius. That night, the engineers compared notes in the officers' mess, their jokes subdued. The little 57mm gun had proven a point they were not ready to accept, that the enemy's strength lay not only in numbers, but in the quiet, relentless logic of practical design. And the Panzer hull outside, pierced again and again by a weapon they had mocked, now stood as silent testimony to that truth. The morning after the first tests, the proving ground at Kummersdorf buzzed with uneasy fascination. The American 57mm gun, dismissed only a day before, had forced its way into every conversation. Engineers who had mocked it now pored over the firing data, trying to explain the results through mathematics rather than admit surprise. They inspected the shattered armor plates again, running gloved fingers over the clean, almost surgical holes. The entry points were smooth, the exit spalls wide and sharp. There was no sign of deformation from a weak shot. Whatever the Americans had done to their ammunition and metallurgy, it worked. The next round of tests would determine whether the first results had been luck or something more alarming. The engineers fitted the gun to a sturdy concrete base, locked the carriage, and prepared to fire at longer ranges. The range crew dragged out a section of a Panzer IV Glasses plate, 80 millimeters thick, sloped at 20 degrees. It was armor the Germans considered safe against anything smaller than 75 millimeters. If the 57 millimeter could not defeat this, the laughter could return. But if it could, the gun fired with a dry, confident bark. The echo rolled through the forested perimeter, followed by the hiss of smoke. When the dust settled, the observers saw a dent the size of a fist and a spiderweb of cracks spreading outward. A second shot followed. This time the plate tore open, shattered not by sheer kinetic energy, but by precision, the shell's hardened cap biting, gripping, and bursting through. The test officer, a quiet man who seldom showed emotion, simply nodded. The Americans had somehow mastered the delicate balance between hardness and ductility that German shell makers still struggled to achieve. In the control room, notes accumulated rapidly. Velocity, over 850 meters per second. Armor penetration, equal to or better than PA 40 at close range, with less recoil and faster reload. Comments. Gun exhibits exceptional ballistic stability and ease of service. Barrel life unknown. Those words were almost heretical in a facility that worshipped complexity. The weapon's lightweight, once a cause for mockery, now appeared as an advantage. A field gun that infantry could move by hand, deploy, fire, and relocate before counterfire found them. By late afternoon, curiosity had overcome pride. The engineers took turns operating the weapon themselves. The mechanism felt solid, deliberate, yet forgiving. A man accustomed to heavy German breech blocks could cycle it with surprising speed. The recoil system, using a compact hydro-spring design, absorbed the shock smoothly. Even the sighting optics, simple glass lenses protected by brass rings, proved precise and sturdy. It was a soldier's gun, born of practicality, not prestige. As daylight faded, the crew fired their last rounds at a disabled Panzer III chassis positioned far downrange. The first shell struck near the driver's vision port and punched through into the transmission housing, blowing metal fragments through the opposite side. The next hit square on the turret ring, locking it in place with brutal efficiency. One more round smashed the internal gun mount clean off. When the smoke cleared, the German tank, once the pride of Africa, stood silent and broken. The laughter that had filled the workshop 2 days earlier never returned. What remained was the sound of pens scratching in notebooks and the quiet, unsettling truth that even a small enemy weapon could kill a German tank with ease. In the following days, the American 57 millimeter gun no longer sat in the corner of the test yard as an oddity. It became a subject of obsession. Every component was stripped, measured, weighed, and photographed. Engineers laid its breech block beside that of the German 5-centimeter PaK 38, comparing design philosophies line by line. The contrast was almost humiliating. Where the German gun displayed meticulous machining, delicate tolerances, and parts that required a master gunsmith's touch, the American piece looked as if it had been built by factory workers in their thousands. The pins were robust, the threads coarse but consistent, the assembly modular. You could replace nearly any piece without refitting another. It was a gun meant for production lines, not laboratories. One of the senior engineers remarked quietly that this was the true danger of American industry. Not their tactics or their commanders, but their to build simple things in unlimited numbers. His colleagues didn't argue. They had seen the inside of the gun's breech, the clever hydraulic recoil buffer that needed no manual adjustment, the straightforward sighting mechanism that a conscript could master in minutes. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. It only had to work every time. Meanwhile, reports began arriving from the Eastern Front. German units there had encountered similar weapons in British and American hands, supplied through Lend-Lease to the Soviets. Tank crews complained that even light, fast-moving Allied guns could penetrate side armor once considered immune. Many of these complaints were dismissed as excuses for poor tactics, until the data from Kummersdorf appeared on the desks of ordnance officials in Berlin. Now the numbers matched the field reports exactly. The laughter that had once filled those offices grew silent. To verify the data, a final demonstration was ordered. A captured M4A1 Sherman, brought from Italy, would serve as the test target. It was stripped of ammunition and fuel, its hull cleaned and repainted with measurement grids. The engineers didn't expect miracles from the little gun, but they were curious how far the American designers had gone in matching gun to armor. When the 57 millimeter was aligned and the first round fired, the result stunned even the most skeptical observer. The projectile struck the Sherman's front plate and shattered, but the follow-up round, aimed slightly lower, pierced through a welded joint and lodged deep in the transmission housing. The Americans had armored their tank just enough to survive the first shot, but not the second. It was efficient, not excessive, a reflection of the same practicality that defined the gun itself. That evening, the head of testing dictated his conclusion. The M157 millimeter, he said, represented the essence of American engineering. Not beauty, not refinement, but effectiveness. Built quickly, maintained easily, and deadly enough to matter. The engineers who once laughed now wrote their findings with quiet respect. In the data tables that followed, one line stood out: Feuerkraft ausreichend zur Vernichtung mittlerer Panzer auf übliche Kampfentfernung. Firepower sufficient to destroy medium tanks at normal combat range. For a weapon they had once dismissed as laughable, it was a confession carved in steel. The story of the 57 millimeter gun spread quietly through Germany's technical community. At first it circulated as rumor, a whispered reminder that the enemy's small weapons were not to be taken lightly. Soon official reports confirmed what whispers had already said. The Americans had managed to create a compact, reliable, and deadly anti-tank system that challenged many of the Reich's assumptions about warfare itself. At Kummersdorf, the engineers prepared the next phase of testing. The objective was to measure the gun's performance under battlefield conditions: rate of fire, barrel wear, and mobility. A team of artillerymen, veterans of the Afrika Korps, were ordered to operate the weapon. They expected another exhausting, finicky trial like those of the heavy German pieces. Instead, they found themselves smiling at how easily it moved. Two men could pivot it by hand. The carriage balanced perfectly, its wheels gliding over packed earth. A single push set it rolling like a cart. It felt almost civilian, as if borrowed from the factory floor rather than the battlefield. During live-fire exercises, the results turned astonishment into respect. The American crew drill, simple, rhythmic, almost industrial, could be replicated within an hour. The rate of fire surpassed anything in the German inventory. The compact shell and sliding breech meant minimal motion between shots. The testers recorded as many as 15 aimed rounds per minute, with the same mechanical consistency that German guns rarely achieved even in ideal conditions. But what impressed them most was endurance. After dozens of rounds, the barrel remained true, the recoil smooth. German weapons often demanded lubrication, recalibration, or cooling after similar strings. The American piece simply continued. It was as though it had been built with the expectation of abuse. The breech never jammed. The recoil cylinders, instead of bleeding fluid like their German counterparts, sealed tightly through rugged gaskets that resisted heat and dirt. When the gun was disassembled after the tests, every part fit back together without adjustment. The tolerances, once mocked as coarse, now revealed their advantage. Dirt or dust that would cripple a precision-machined German system merely brushed aside in the M1's design. It was foolproof by intent. The test report described it with an unfamiliar word for German engineering circles: unempfindlich, unfussy. Back in Berlin, the Ordnance Office read these results with quiet alarm. The Americans had taken British theory, industrialized it, and made it better. They were not producing weapons to showcase brilliance. They were building instruments to win a long war. And though the 57 millimeter gun was small, it symbolized something far larger: the industrial mind of a nation that could outproduce and outlast any opponent. When word reached the front that German engineers had praised an enemy weapon, disbelief followed. Yet those who faced the 57 millimeter in battle already knew. Tank crews on the Italian front wrote that the American small guns bit like wolves, able to strike side armor from ranges that forced caution even on panzer commanders. What had begun as laughter in a laboratory was now fear on the battlefield. The more the engineers studied the 57 millimeter gun, the clearer it became that it wasn't a miracle of physics. It was a triumph of philosophy. German weapons had been built like watches, precise, intricate, and intolerant of failure. The American gun was built like a tool. It had been designed to be manufactured by hundreds of factories, maintained by mechanics with minimal training, and used by soldiers who might have seen it for the first time in combat. Every rivet, spring, and weld seemed to whisper the same idea. Make it simple, make it strong, make it work. A deeper round of trials began in the summer. The gun was dragged through mud, dust, and water, left exposed for days, and then fired again without cleaning. It kept working. Even when the barrel heated until its paint burned away, the breech opened smoothly, the shell cases slid out cleanly, and the recoil buffer stayed firm. The observers grew quiet. They knew how their own guns would have fared under the same abuse. The POC-40, magnificent on paper, often seized after heavy use. Its complex components demanded attention like a temperamental engine. The M1 asked for none. The next test was designed to measure penetration against live armor, not static plates. A damaged Stuggy 3 assault gun was hauled from storage and positioned on the far side of the range. The 57mm gun's crew, by now a mix of skeptical officers and converted believers, took aim at 600 meters. The first shot rang out, its impact sending a dull metallic echo across the trees. The shell punched through the upper hull, exploded inside, and blew the commander's cupola clean off. The German officers watching the test did not cheer, nor speak. They had just seen their own machine, one of the most feared weapons of the Eastern Front, defeated by something that weighed barely a third as much. The data sheets grew longer with every firing. Velocity, 853 meters per second. Penetration at 500 meters, 80 millimeters at 30 degrees. Dispersion minimal. Recoil acceptable. Rate of fire unmatched. Words like surprisingly effective appeared again and again, each time crossed out and replaced with something colder. Effective beyond expectation. In the margin of one report, an anonymous engineer wrote, "If they can make 10,000 of these, we cannot stop them." That night, the head of testing dictated his findings for Berlin. His tone carried no emotion, only fact. The American 57mm M1, he said, combined manufacturing efficiency with tactical effectiveness at a level Germany could not replicate without rebuilding its entire industrial base. It was a weapon for a war of attrition, precisely the war Germany was losing. He ended his memo with a warning that would later circulate through the armaments ministry. The enemy's genius lies not in invention, but in application. Outside the workshop, the test gun rested beneath a tarp, its steel still warm. It had done nothing extraordinary, only what it was designed to do again and again, without complaint. For the engineers who had once laughed at it, that was the most frightening thing of all. By late summer 1943, the 57mm gun had become an uncomfortable legend within the testing grounds. Every officer who witnessed its trials left with a quiet respect for the enemy's practicality. Yet the findings were not to be publicized. The Armaments Office classified the reports as "nur für Dienstgebrauch," for official use only. Germany could not afford the morale cost of admitting that a foreign weapon, half the size of their own, could outperform their vaunted designs in key areas. Still, the data spread, whispered between engineers, officers, and production managers like forbidden scripture. At Kummersdorf, the narrative shifted from ridicule to analysis. The team began studying why the 57mm was so successful. They examined the projectile's metallurgy, tungsten cord variants, armor-piercing capped shells, and the clever balance of hardness and elasticity. German shell casings were often too brittle, their caps prone to shatter on sloped armor. The Americans had avoided this mistake. Their heat treatment favored reliability over perfection, ensuring that each round behaved predictably in battle. Predictability, something every soldier desired and every German weapon seemed to lack. The engineers conducted comparative drills with the POC-40, Germany's standard 75mm gun. On paper, the POC-40 was superior in penetration and range. In the field, the story was different. The 57mm gun could be deployed twice as fast, fired 3 times as often, and required half the crew fatigue. Its lighter carriage allowed infantry to reposition under fire, a tactical advantage that raw power could not replace. One observer noted bitterly that German doctrine had traded flexibility for spectacle. "We built weapons for parade," he said, "and they built them for war." A visiting ordnance officer from Berlin watched one of these demonstrations and asked whether the gun could destroy a Tiger tank. The question drew an uneasy silence. No one wanted to test that. But the engineers knew the truth. At close range and with tungsten core ammunition, even the mighty Tiger's side armor was vulnerable. The small American weapon, laughed at for its size, could threaten the pride of German armored warfare if given the right shot. Later that week, the 57mm was disassembled for its endurance inspection. After hundreds of rounds, the bore was still serviceable. The recoil system showed no leaks. The only visible wear came from the hands that had operated it. To the German eye, this was uncanny. No weapon held together so long without complaint. The simplicity they had mocked was now recognized as its greatest strength. As the team finalized their final report, a kind of reverence filled the room. They understood that this gun was not just a piece of steel, it was a message from a rival civilization. It spoke of an industrial culture that prized consistency over brilliance, cooperation over genius, and production over pride. It was the embodiment of the American way of war, not dazzling but unstoppable. And as dusk settled over Kummersdorf, the narrator's voice might have whispered through the corridors of history itself. Sometimes the quietest weapons speak the loudest truths. By autumn, the 57mm gun had become a permanent fixture at Kummersdorf. It was no longer just a test subject, but a reference, something German designers quietly measured their own weapons against. The initial laughter that had greeted its arrival months before had long since faded into reluctant admiration. Yet beneath that admiration simmered unease. If this was the kind of weapon the Americans built as standard issue, what else were they capable of producing in their endless factories across the ocean? The engineers began cross-referencing reports from the front. Field units in Italy and Normandy had described being pinned down by small, fast-firing Allied guns that seemed to appear everywhere. Soldiers called them mosquitoes. Light, quick, but deadly. Tanks that advanced too far without infantry cover came back with holes punched clean through their side plates. The men firing those weapons were rarely professionals. Sometimes they were simple infantrymen trained in a few weeks. Yet their effectiveness matched the best German anti-tank crews. The message was clear. Design could compensate for training. A weapon built for ease of use multiplied the power of an army tenfold. In Berlin, some officials dismissed these concerns. They argued that larger guns like the 88 or the massive Pa-43 would dominate any battlefield. But engineers at Kummersdorf, armed with data, knew the flaw in that thinking. Those heavy weapons required trucks, fuel, and time, resources Germany no longer possessed in abundance. The 57mm, by contrast, could be unlimbered and ready to fire in moments. Its crew could move it by hand if needed. It embodied agility, the very thing the Reich's industry had sacrificed in pursuit of perfection. A final experiment was ordered before winter closed the range. The engineers would test the gun against the latest Panther hull, salvaged from an assembly line near Magdeburg. Even the crew believed this was folly. The Panther's frontal armor was 80mm thick, sloped sharply, impervious to almost anything short of a direct hit from an 88mm shell. The test would be symbolic, little more than a gesture to satisfy curiosity. But curiosity has a way of rewriting certainty. The first shot struck high and glanced away, deflecting harmlessly. The second hit lower, at a weld seam. A dull crack echoed through the field. Observers peered through their scopes and fell silent. The round hadn't fully penetrated, but it had driven a deep crater into the steel, peeling the inner surface inward like torn fabric. The third shot, using an experimental tungsten core round, hit the same spot and broke through. The projectile smashed into the transmission housing, sending shards of armor spinning through the air. The Panther, symbol of German engineering pride, sat still, smoke curling from the wound in its nose. For a long time, no one moved. The lead engineer lowered his binoculars and simply said, "Now we know." What had begun as a demonstration ended as revelation. The laughter that once filled the workshop seemed a lifetime ago. The American 57mm gun, small and plain, had done the unthinkable. It had cracked a Panther. After the Panther test, the proving ground fell quiet. The engineers avoided conversation about what they had seen. A weapon they had once called harmless had pierced the symbol of their armored supremacy. The official report would not mention humiliation. It would describe localized weld failure and exceptional test conditions. But everyone in that range crew knew the truth. The American 57mm had proven its worth beyond theory. The gun was returned to its shed, its barrel still faintly warm from the last firing. Beside it stood the wreck of the Panther hull, a wound visible even in dim light. For days, small groups of engineers came to inspect the damage again, as if the result might change overnight. Some measured the crater again and again, hoping for a miscalculation. None found one. The data was undeniable. A round fired from 57mm of steel had defeated the most advanced tank in Europe. Behind the technical findings lay something far deeper, a realization that Germany's war machine, for all its brilliance, had built itself into a corner. The engineers discussed it quietly among themselves. German tanks were masterpieces but fragile, their production slow and delicate. Each one required hundreds of hours of labor and rare metals that were running out. The Americans, by contrast, produced thousands of simpler designs, each reliable, easy to maintain, and deadly when combined with discipline and numbers. The 57mm gun embodied that philosophy perfectly. It didn't rely on exotic materials or complex geometry. It relied on sound engineering that never asked too much of its builders. The following week, a visiting officer from the Ministry of Armaments arrived to witness the test for himself. He read the reports in silence, then asked to see the weapon. When he ran his hand along the barrel, he frowned. "It is too simple," he said, almost in disbelief. "We could never build something like this." The engineers exchanged uneasy glances. He didn't mean they lacked the skill. He meant they lacked the culture. German engineering was wedded to perfection, incapable of accepting good enough as success. Yet good enough was winning the war. The final evaluation session focused on endurance firing. The gun was loaded, aimed, and fired until the crew could barely stand the heat radiating from the barrel. Even then, the mechanism never failed. The recoil cylinder held, the carriage bolts stayed tight, and the breech continued to cycle with mechanical confidence. When the barrel finally cooled, the crew gathered around it in silence. They were no longer testing an enemy weapon. They were learning from it. Later, when the last report was filed, the lead engineer wrote a note at the bottom of the page. It wasn't part of the official record. It was a reflection meant only for those who understood. "We did not lose to numbers," he wrote. "We lost to the idea that simplicity is weakness." Outside, the autumn wind swept through the range, rattling the empty shell cases scattered in the dirt. The American 57mm gun stood in the fading light, its muzzle dark against the evening sky. A small weapon that had just rewritten everything the Germans thought they knew about war. In the cold months that followed, Kummersdorf turned gray and silent. Snow covered the firing lanes, muffling the echoes that once marked every test. Inside the workshops, the engineers pored over stacks of data, recalculating penetration figures, impact angles, and metallurgical tolerances. But no new numbers could soften the truth the 57mm gun had exposed. Germany's engineering doctrine, its pride, its identity, had become a burden. The Americans had won not through brilliance, but through discipline of design. The engineers dissected their findings like doctors studying an unwelcome diagnosis. They noted that the 57mm armor-piercing shell used an unusually stable propellant, one that burned evenly across temperatures and pressures. Its simplicity made logistics effortless. One cartridge type, one fuse, interchangeable parts. German guns, in contrast, required multiple shell variants, each demanding separate training, materials, and storage. Every small advantage had become a logistical nightmare. The Americans had streamlined chaos into order. In the corner of the workshop, the original test gun sat half disassembled for analysis. Its barrel, after hundreds of rounds, showed only mild wear. The breech, still bright and clean, closed with the same sharp metallic click it had on the first day. The German mechanics, men who had once sneered at its crude appearance, now handled it with something approaching reverence. They had learned that simplicity was not the enemy of quality. It was its foundation. As news from the front grew darker, retreats in the east, bombing raids over the heart of Germany, the engineers began to see their work differently. The 57 millimeter was no longer just a captured gun. It was a warning. Every shattered tank, every broken gearbox, every overcomplicated mechanism symbolized the same flaw. Perfectionism had strangled practicality. One evening, a young assistant, staring at the American gun, asked a question that hung in the cold air. "Do you think they understand what they built?" The senior engineer hesitated. "No," he said quietly. "They don't have to. It's enough that it works." That answer carried more weight than any report. The engineers realized they were witnessing a shift in history, one where wars would no longer be decided by whose machine was the most advanced, but by whose machine could be built, maintained, and replaced the fastest. The 57 millimeter gun, in all its plainness, had revealed that future. Before the year ended, the weapon was packed away for storage. Its steel trails were tagged with a simple label: Nicht zerstören, für Vergleichsversuche. Do not destroy, for comparison tests. It would never fire again, but its lessons had already done their work. In a silent workshop filled with snowlight, the narrator might have said what none of them dared to admit aloud: that in the clash between ingenuity and practicality, it is not the proud who endure, it is the efficient. Months later, as the war turned irrevocably against Germany, the Kummersdorf proving ground stood half abandoned. Air raid sirens howled across Brandenburg almost every night, and much of the testing staff had been drafted or dispersed to other facilities. In one of the remaining sheds, under a tarp darkened by soot, the American 57 millimeter gun still waited. Its trails were rusting now, the paint chipped, but the barrel remained straight and clean. It had outlasted many of the weapons designed to surpass it. When Soviet forces drew closer to Berlin, orders arrived to burn sensitive files. But the lead engineer could not bring himself to destroy the reports on the 57 millimeter gun. Instead, he sealed them in a steel box and marked it Technische Erkenntnisse, nicht vernichten. Technical findings, do not destroy. Perhaps, he thought, someone after the war might read them and understand what they had learned too late. Those notes, recovered years later by Allied investigators, were astonishing in their honesty. They described not only the gun's performance, but the revelation it had forced upon German engineering. The American 57 millimeter M1, one page read, represents an industrial concept alien to our philosophy. The design values ease of production, maintenance, and training above all else, yet achieves remarkable battlefield results. This is the product of a nation where mass industry is the engineer, and the engineer is the soldier. It was not a compliment, but a confession. After the war, those who survived carried the memory of that weapon into a new age of design. Many would later work on the Bundeswehr's Leopard program, or for civilian manufacturers rebuilding from the ashes. They spoke rarely about the war, but when the subject of the 57 millimeter came up, they called it a turning point. One engineer, decades later, told a researcher, "It was the first time I realized that perfect engineering is not the same as effective engineering." The Americans, for their part, soon replaced the 57 millimeter gun with more powerful weapons as armor improved. Yet the spirit behind it, the drive for reliability, the faith in practical design, never faded. It became the quiet doctrine that guided post-war mechanization. Build it simple, make it last, let it work. At Kummersdorf, after the fighting ended, Allied teams cataloged the wreckage. They found the Panther hull still resting near the range, the hole from that tungsten round untouched by time. Nearby lay the 57 millimeter gun, half buried in mud. A British officer who inspected it recognized the lineage immediately, the old 6-pounder, reborn in American hands. He smiled, brushed the frost from its serial number, and ordered it shipped to London for study. There, on another proving ground, it fired again. The barrel, still straight after hundreds of German test rounds, spoke once more with the same sharp crack. Its shell struck the target plate and punched clean through. The observers nodded, not in surprise but in recognition. The little gun had nothing left to prove, and somewhere in that sound, half echo, half memory, lingered the lesson Kummersdorf had learned and history would never forget: that power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through steel, steady and unbroken, built by hands that understand the strength of simplicity. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.